So I guess the first thing I will say is there is nothing new about flooding. You might be asking me like, well, why am I talking about flooding? Floods have been around since, I don't know, the biblical flood. They are not a new thing. And real estate operators are aware of floods. So where am I going with this? Well, I think all the science points to that with increasing climate change, floods are going to become more frequent, they're going to become more severe, they're going to become more unpredictable, and they're going to affect areas that haven't been affected before, and they're also going to affect areas that are already at risk more tangibly. So the chart on the left there looks at a bunch of Canadian cities, a bunch of municipalities, and ranks them by how many of their buildings would be flooded under a once-in-a-century flood. Now, Chilliwack, just right down the Fraser Valley from here, is in the unfortunate position of being in the top of the leaderboard there, with about 46% of its buildings being submerged by a once-in-a-century flood. I guess the bad news is, though, that these once-in-a-century floods are not really necessarily once in a century anymore. They are once every 20 years. Maybe they're once every 10 years, and maybe you get 2 years back to back where you have a once-in-a-century flood. So that obviously, the changing nature of that risk, the changing nature of flooding risk, is certainly something that real estate operators, builders, and developers and operators need to be aware of. Why? I mean, it's kind of obvious, really. You know, there's the cost of the damages. There's revenue disruption if you have to pull tenants out. There's inflating cap rates. There's limitations on land for construction. And maybe one thing that people don't think about is the insurability of properties, whether they are properties that are about to be built or whether they are properties that are already built. Now, the Canadian government has said that for properties sitting on floodplains, they will reimburse the owners of those properties in the initial instance where they are currently uninsurable. The Canadian government will back them up. But I think, and people might correct me if I'm wrong here, I think that is a one-time offer. So if you get wiped out by a flood and you're not insured, the Canadian government will come to your rescue once, but they will not do it time and time again. So insurability is another big thing. But from the perspective of banks, from the perspective of financial institutions, coming back to this kind of key message that I said, like climate risk is credit risk to us. And so if you don't manage climate risk in what you're doing, it will become harder and harder to get access to credit. You know, the price of credit, the price of debt will increase, the volume of debt that you can access will decrease, and it may dry up completely because, you know, I don't mean to sound mean here, but banks aren't in the business of lending money where they don't get it back. And physical risk plays into that massively. I guess the final thing I would say on this slide is I don't want to anchor on flooding too much, like this is the only thing we care about. I think I highlighted in the previous slide many of the other examples of physical climate risk. Some of them are obvious, like wildfires, particularly after what we've seen this summer. Maybe some of them are less obvious. But a couple of years ago, we saw temperatures I think hit 42 degrees in Vancouver and 46 degrees in Lytton, BC. So if you're operating a building that is not resilient in temperatures like that, then again, your business model is not particularly strong and you're going to find it hard to get credit. So it's not just all about floods, despite this slide being all about floods.